For me, wood is a lens to look at history.
James, you're giving me goosebumps.
First and foremost, everyone that's here, thank you for being here. This is an amazing turnout. I think I speak for everyone in this room, James, Matt, and Andrew, that this is more than we expected. So thank you for being here. My name is Nick Schiffer. I own a construction firm in Boston, Massachusetts called NS Builders. I'm a general contractor. We also have a millwork division and a media division that's happened to be in front of me right now. I'm joined by James Rob from Madera.
Yeah, thanks for coming, everyone. My name is James Rob. I'm one of the owners and founders of Madera. This is our showroom here at 909 Broadway, and thank you.
And Matt Berman.
Hi, folks. Thank you all for coming. My name is Matt Berman. I'm one of the founding principals of Workshop APD. We're an architecture, design, and product firm in the city, and have worked with Madera on a number of projects, and we're excited to talk to Nick and
soon to work together.
See what happens tonight, yeah.
And then Andrew Kline.
I'm Andrew Kline. I'm a big fan of Nick's podcast. That's why I'm here. I'm good friends with James, and I work with Matt at Workshop. I'm an associate principal.
So today we're going to be talking about conscious craftsmanship and how it relates to natural materials. Matt, you just actually touched on one of the first things I want to talk about, which I find the most interesting about Workshop, is that for me,
3-letter codes.
That was offline. Okay. For me, like when I was, introduced to you guys, it was architecture. And as I dug into, what you guys do, you guys also do product. So talk to me a little bit about, how you go from architecture and interior into product design.
Because we're ADD.
Okay.
We suffer from tremendous ADD. No, I think for us, architecture and design is incredibly fluid. So we were trained as architects. The other founding partner and I, Andrew, were trained as architects. When you're practicing architecture largely initially in New York City, you're really practicing interior design, right? You're working on a lot of apartments. And so we found that we were doing a lot of the architecture, and then interior design, no offense to the interior designers in the room, would come in and sort of take ownership of the project. And I think as architects, we were a little frustrated by that. So we started to expand into interior design, which then led us to expand from residential work into other arenas. We got into hospitality work, multifamily residential work, social clubs, things like that. And again, it gets back to that design is fluid. When you're interested in design and when you're passionate about it, you're thinking of design at all scales. So whether we're talking about the relationship between a home and its surroundings, or we're talking about the relationship of cabinetry in a room, or the relationship of a pillow to a sofa, right? We're thinking about those relationships, and it's an incredibly kind of fluid spectrum where you want all the design to relate. And so for us, it was kind of an obvious extension as we grew from architecture and into interior design to then expand into product. That was a long-winded answer.
No, I appreciate that. I think, we kind of debrief on a lot of our projects and talk, when we build, and some of the conversations I've had with architects and interior designers that we've worked with, I've always asked, like, what's your favorite project that you've worked on, or like, what have you enjoyed the most? And it always kind of relates back to the one that they were able to control all the way to the completion. And I think a lot of us can speak to the fact that, we build it, and when we don't get that final touch, whether it's furniture or anything, we run this risk of not knowing how it's going to end up. And can we photograph it before someone puts their own taste?
Look, I think architects and designers by nature are kind of control freaks, yeah. Right? You're trying to control a world which is not in your control. And I think that you design things, we all design things, and you design them in a perfect space, right? If you're designing either by hand or on the computer, that's perfection, right? Everything lines up, everything's perfect. You spec something, you vision it, the rendering is all perfect. And then you get into actual building, and building is an imperfect process, and there are a lot of different influences, and a lot of things go wrong, and we all know that. And so I think for us, sort of the ability to sort of own more of the process and to sort of see more of it through and frankly be in control of more of it just allowed us, I think, to feel better about what we do.
Sure.
And to try to get closer to that sort of sense of perfection.
So Andrew, you run a lot of the product design and the product design team. How does your role kind of intertwine between product and architecture?
What's interesting, 8 years ago now. When I started, we were really trying to move into hospitality, and one of the first conversations we had together was, if we're going to do that, we really need to become big in the product side, because we wanted to custom design all the furniture for the guest rooms and a lot of the lobby spaces and things like that. And it goes back to that holistic vision. But what we realized was we were kind of already doing it for our private residential clients. And so our product collection has really been born out of 20 years of problem solving in our own projects and looking for product that we couldn't find out on the market and creating it ourselves.
You talk about collection, but you guys also do one-off, and that's not necessarily a part of a collection, right?
Yeah, so our product kind of hits lots of different points. We have partnerships, licenses, like our collection with Callista, plug in the bathtub, marketing's gonna be happy. And then we end our lighting with our tiers, and then we also do bespoke things just for our projects. So we may design a custom sofa just for one of our clients, custom chairs, etc. Hospitality, we design a lot of custom product because the whole guest room is a custom package. And then we've recently launched Workshop Collection, which is kind of our favorite products that we've made that we're now making available to our peers in the trade.
That's cool. Matt, you have this this mentality or mantra, one material, one move. You know, talk to me what that means to you and to Workshop as a whole.
You know, I think from a very early stage, when we were kind of writing about our values and what was important to us and things like that, we would start with this idea of design first, right? In fact, if you look at like our early marketing information, I think the first page said design first, period. And it was this idea that, you know, that we value that, right? We think that life is better because of good design. And
is it not?
Well, it's funny, we were having an interesting conversation about going to Italy and Milan coming up, and just like the level of design coming out of Italy. Yeah. As a small country versus the level of design coming out of other places, like a big country like ours, is interestingly offset. But anyway, separate topic. But I think, you know, we early on in our career, we started to sort of play with materials. We've always loved really honest materials that have character and things like this. And we realized that, you know, if you can achieve good design, right? Subjective, but to a certain degree. But if you can achieve good design with one move and one material, there's a purity to that. And so I think, you know, the plug for the bathtub that we did for Callista, that's sort of one material with this incredible texture on the outside. It's not overdone, it's not overdesigned, it's really one material, one move, and there's something really pure and beautiful about it. And I think that we like to think of design as something that's super creative, but also requires editing and refinement. And so if you can edit things out, I think we've all sort of seen a lot of design, furniture design, whatever, and you look at something, you're like, they almost got it right. Like there's some, you know, and so I think that it just requires that constant editing process. And that's where it's like, you can reduce it down to a material and a move and the result is something truly beautiful, then you've nailed it.
I think the word reduce is so underused in design, where it's like, truthfully, that is a powerful move in design, and really ties into what you guys, you know, your mantra is seamless wood design. Yep. So when I heard the one material, one move, I'm like, I mean, there's a natural connection.
100%.
For us, that is seamless wood, and in its truest essence.
And what is that like? What does that mean for you and Madera, and, you know, and the projects that you're a part of?
Well, for us, it's just taking. For us, it's wood, right? It's not bathtubs. It's not stone, but we still respect that.
You could do a wood bathtub.
Of course. Well, you're right. You know, they do in Japan and among many places. But it's the idea of taking this species, the single species, and taking it from the forest to the floor, right? Taking it from where this is this conduit of history, this piece of history, and we're taking it and we're using it in all these multifaceted ways, one material, and we're putting it into a project. And for us, the truest expression, the finest expression of that woodcraft is when it can go into all these different elements. One material, one move. Where that oak, let's say it's oak, right? Where that can enter through the floor, go into the walls, go into the casework, the millwork, the staircase, and then end up in a piece of furniture. I know, Nick, that you are working with Vincent on a very cool project up in Boston, where the idea is to take that wood and move it throughout the space, and it's going to end up in a beautiful custom designed table. So the same material will end up in the table.
Yeah, that's one. I mean, shout out to Vincent, who's here from Of Possible. And that's really how we got connected. Is that we had this whole seamless wood design and one material, one move, and for us, it's white oak. Interestingly, the road that it's on is also named White Oak. So just really stuck with the brand there. It would have been a shame if we done.
What you're talking about, though, it's interesting. If you think about sort of different approaches to design, there are many designers who look at maybe more in interior design, but who look at each room as its own vignette. And what you're talking about is very much sort of the family of the world we come from, where you're taking a material and letting it thread through the experience from beginning to end. So, you're going to have a different type of experience in each space based on the architecture, based on the subtlety of the textures and things like that. But there's a continuity of idea from the moment you enter, maybe even from the outside, all the way through all of the spaces.
We're talking about materiality, but to be more specific, natural materials. And I think that as we talk amongst ourselves, and maybe a lot of you guys in this room are thinking the same thing, that we're talking about natural materials, but that's not always the case. Why is natural material, and any of you guys can answer this, why is natural material really the go-to in this conversation?
I think there's like an honesty, and I think that designers are drawn to something that doesn't feel fake, a genuine mentality behind the material. I also think natural materials just weather better. They last the test of time.
One could argue that these synthetic materials, not to bash them, but are trying to be this material that doesn't weather.
Yeah.
Where it's like, hey, you want perfect, here's an opportunity to be forever perfect, which has
never looks perfect.
No, and truthfully, like for me, and I think a lot of people, it strips the beauty out of it.
Yeah, there's also a difference to the touch, the feel, the sound. Stepping on an LVT floor versus a hardwood floor.
We weren't going to mention LVT.
Yeah, well, I wasn't going to mention Madera's new LVT line. Just
Which
kidding.
is not happening, never will.
James will kill me. But yeah, it's fake. Yeah.
I think we talk about hand in a lot of our work, that we want our work to have hand. And that obviously comes from the idea of hand of fabrics and things like that. But it's not just fabric that has hand, and frankly, it's not even just a tactile hand. It can be a visual hand. Like this has hand, right? You don't need to touch it to know it. You see it. And I think that when we think about sort of what that experience of a space is, spaces and materials that have hand to them, we think just are sort of more inviting and warmer and things you connect to, and maybe even you don't know why, but how many of us have walked into a restaurant or a hotel and you like run your fingers along the wall, right? I touch the walls all the time. I'm like getting yelled at, stop touching the walls. But you walk up a stair rail and it's been wrapped with leather and there's a stitching and you feel your fingers kind of touch it. There's a tactility to it that helps connect you to a space. And so I think that's sort of why we just are always drawn to honest materials.
We're both weirdos, because I'm the guy who's like, why is this guy touching the floor? Why is he, get off the floor, James?
My husband is embarrassed by me most of the time.
I think we talk a lot about how we all live in this digital world now. We're always touching glass screens. We're on cameras. We've got two screens here, one down here, phone over here, and it's like, after a while, that's exhausting, and you just want to go into something that feels natural, textural, something that has a little bit of imperfection instead of always being perfect. Metals that patina.
It's funny you talk about the digital world, because renderings have gotten so popular and so impressive, and for a lot of our projects, we're rendering them and we're seeing what this house will look like in its final state. But then you go through this process of ordering materials and samples, and they start showing up, and then our foundation goes in the ground, and we're there and we're starting to experience it, and you realize that all of what you've been looking at on a screen is just imagination, and you don't really have that experience. You know what visually it looks like, but you don't feel the stitching in the handrail. You don't understand the scale in which a foundation wall looks. You don't realize that the brick tile is perfectly imperfect, or it has this weight to it, or hand, as you say. When you think about materials, and we'll stick with wood, and I'll ask you, there's the staples, but what materials are you most interested in terms of when you see design kind of evolving, especially in your space?
Well, for me, it's just about integrity of the material, and it's about a material that will last, that will perfectly age and wear with time. Now, obviously for me, it's wood, but it's also stone. I love leather, I love textiles, fabrics, but real material that is only going to get better with age. And that's the most important thing, is that it's, for me, I want to do projects, I want to build spaces that designed by you, built by you, sourced by me, that will be here when we are long gone. It kills me that we work sometimes in an industry that is a little bit artifice, where you have these $1 million projects where you put something in and it's going to get ripped out. It kills me, it really does, on a deep level. Like, I want to be doing projects that are intentionally designed, well built, that will last well beyond us. And that's what gets me most excited, and that's what I get most passionate about.
That's why you should hire designers too. I think people forget that. We're seeing so much stuff that just gets thrown out. But if you hire a designer who's really going to put passion and love into your space, it's going to become timeless. It's going to last longer. And if you use real materials.
Yeah.
Timeless. Explain that. What does that mean to you?
That's interesting. I think timeless probably means something to anyone, but when Matt says something like one material, one move, I think the essence of that is trying to create something that will last a long time, that's timeless. I don't think that our work is trend focused so much. I think maybe the last layer of accessories could be sometimes, or coloration. Color can change. But when you think about modern design, really rooted in the beginning of modernism in America, that's what we're working with. We say this term crafted modern all the time at workshop. And Matt will make a joke about cheese now and beer. But it's it truly is this idea of
He knows me very well.
It's been a while. It really is about creating something that's living in the world of modernism, but is warm and comfortable and livable. This showroom is a very good example of crafted modern. And I don't think any of this is not going to be timeless. We're going to come in here for years and enjoy this space.
You talk about modern design and modern architecture. You guys do a lot of work on Nantucket, which is known for really stringent rules and historic regulation. How do you work on an area that has that jurisdiction, and how do you make it, we'll call it workshop APD?
This is going to be a two-part answer. I'm going to take the first part, and Andrew's going to take the second part. The first part, and the honest answer, is that we've been working there for now over 25 years. And when
I haven't been.
Andrew. And just like we've been working in New York City for over 25 years, right? We cut our teeth in both of those worlds.
Yeah.
And in both areas, right? Now you think of our work, right? And I think most people would call it modern or warm modern or something like that. If you were to look at the work from 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, we were doing classic Upper East Side and West Side apartments with built-up crown and and heavy door casing and plinth blocks and all that stuff. And we were doing the same thing in Nantucket. We were restoring historic Nantucket homes. Now you're not going to find that. You're not going to find that on our website. You're not going to find that in our portfolio because it's not who we sell ourselves as. But it was a learning. It was an incredible learning process. Right? To learn, to understand pre-war buildings in New York and how they're organized and how you have to respect the language of the structure in order to layer into it. That was a learning. That was an education to understand how you build on Nantucket and to understand what the kind of the fundamental nature, the character of that place is, understand the history, the whaling history, really understand what that place is about was an education. And I say that because now, given that education, understanding the history and understanding the geometries of both places, we have been able to slowly push through it, use it as an inspiration, and begin to talk about it and interpret it in, let's say, a progressive way. And I'm going to turn that over to you, but that was the setup.
And I would say that that's editing, right? The same thing we were talking about before. It's like reduction and editing. What's so interesting about Nantucket is if you look at the really historic work, it's very modern. It's gable boxes.
No ornamentation.
No ornamentation, and it's additive massing. You know, when they needed to add onto a home, they did. So that created very interesting shapes. What we have tried to do, or for like the last 8 years, what I've been working on with Workshop is like to create a language of gable-style pavilions and connected massing that is born out of early Nantucket work. And so I think there's this like idea of traditionalism, the restoration hardware of it all, that happened to Nantucket, where all of these big mansions that are very much not at the heart of the Quaker style architecture sort of took over. And when you pull that back and you think about additive massing, you think about beautiful gable boxes connected, all of a sudden you're getting living rooms with 3 sides of glass. All of a sudden you're pulling living spaces apart and creating moments of contemplation and connection. And it really is more true to the sensibilities of the history of the space. And we're actually starting to see that come around. If you really want to nerd out, you can watch HDC on YouTube, the Historic Commission. And like when you speak about architecture that way, and you really respect, to Matt's point, learning about the space, you can push through more modern ideas because they're actually rooted in history.
Well, it's interesting, like both of you guys made really, I think, important points, is that you talk about this process of understanding the build-up, right? Like the heavily ornate project, and how that was so instrumental for you to understand, to do that, to then learn how to reduce. And that brings us back to like the beginning of that conversation of reduction and modernism. But your point of, you know, tying it back to true early modernism, you know, I would agree. It's, you see these homes that, you know, I'll classify them as like shingle style, and that became what was Nantucket. And to understand that process, I think for a lot of people, you know, especially other architects and other designers, it's when they're faced with a challenge like that, you know, those are both really important, you know, kind of paths to get to, you know, where you want to be. It's also interesting to hear that you have this whole portfolio of work that is, you know, not tied to what you did or what you do now.
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly part of the education. I mean, like, you know, you think about, why do you what does crown molding do, or what you know, heavy casing around a door with plinth blocks do, right? You think about, well, it softens a transition. So now, you know, when you think about softening a transition to ceiling, we might cove a ceiling now. Like, we're still inspired by that. When you think about sort of what a casing might do, right? That it's got a lot of like ribs in it and things like that. It's creating shadow line, it's creating definition, it's articulating entry. You'll find in our work now, you'll see a lot of reveals used everywhere, which really crispen up an entry and create a very clean threshold. We might now, instead of defining the perimeter of an opening through casing, we might define the jamb. And now the jamb is articulated in a wood, maybe contrasted against a white wall, set against a really nice 1/4-inch reveal going all the way around. You're doing the same thing, right? You're sort of following through the same idea of how you're articulating an opening, but now, again, doing it in a more progressive way, thinking about it, deconstructing it, putting it back together, and then editing it back down. So I think for us, it was all about that education.
Yeah. James, when you think about, you know, design specific to, you know, modern versus, you know, more traditional, and how materials have evolved, what's been your experience in terms of like learning about, you know, the, you know, more traditional hardwood floor and wood product?
I tell the story a lot, but it's still one of my, it's still worth repeating. It's one of my favorite projects was doing the Park Avenue Armory. And I mean, I got a PhD in heart pine, and it was the most expensive PhD I could have ever gotten. But it was like you guys got, boots on the ground. I had to live through it. So this was the Park Avenue Armory. The, you know, Conservancy came to us to restore their Wade Thompson drill hall, 44,000 square foot space. It's the size of a city block. And that was my deep dive into wood, history, materiality, and having to go back to look at the original bill of sale, which they showed us, 1877, bought from a lumber yard down in the Carolinas, and they wanted to replicate that floor. And so how lucky was I, with a team that are many of are here today, to be able to delve into that and source that material. And that's where I really got to understand just like this, the tradition, the American tradition of because there is a rich American tradition of woodcraft. Now, again, we look to Italy, we look to Europe, because they're so progressive when it comes to technology and things like that, but especially around furniture and flooring. But there is this incredible history in this country, and being able to tap into that for this one project and work for clients who really appreciated that, who were willing to spend the extra money to do it. So we got to go back in time. We got to go back into the late 19th century, or actually the mid 19th century, and find that material. And we were able to find it in a distillery in Kentucky, in a shoe factory in St. Louis, in an old Chicago stockyards, even in New York City. You know, we're actually one of the biggest libraries, if you will, or sinks of heart pine in America is actually in New York City. It's all around us. It's in the buildings that you see all around us. It's there. And we're able to get it when these buildings are transformed, when they come down, when they're renovated. But that was like an eye-opening experience for me. It just being able to look back, because for me, wood is a lens to look at history. And I
James, you're giving me goosebumps.
I could talk all night about this.
Your smile was getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
You want to hear about goosebumps? No, I wasn't going to go there, but I will now. But so I had the experience to walk through an oak forest in France last fall, and this is towards the Belgian border near the Somme Valley, and we're walking through this oak forest. It all started because the sawyer told us about a log they had gotten where there was a piece of shrapnel in it. And if you read up history, the amount of people who lost their lives in the Valley of the Somme, and the forest took them. These bodies were never recovered. And now we are there. We are harvesting these, cutting these logs that have been grown and sustained by that forest. And it's a very, very humbling, and like that gives me goosebumps thinking about that. And now we're able to put that and transform that into a sustainable material that will last for another century.
You don't get that story with LVT.
You do not. And you don't get that story when you're VEing your project either. So the two worst acronyms, LVT and VE. Yeah. But that, for me, that wood is the lens of history, and that's what I love. Yeah. It's a way to look at the past, but then also put it into the future.
Andrew, what about you in terms of when you're designing understanding the history of materials, or even design, like we talk about modernism, but specific to materials and natural materials, what is the process that you might go through to understand, if the product is right or that material is right for a particular project?
It's interesting. I know you're asking about materials, but I actually kind of want to take it as
you can go in any direction you want.
I'm going to take it back. So everybody's, Pinterest now, and we love and we hate it and everything. But it's a visual research tool. And what's interesting is when we're researching like a history or a historical design, we will many times research like traditional box paneling and think about how we can, to Matt's point, simplify that and use it in our project. But for materials, I think it's more about relationships to find out about great materials. It's if you've ever walked through a stone yard with somebody who's as passionate about stone as James is about wood, you leave there being like, I'm gonna put stone everywhere, And so that kind of research really comes through partnerships with people who are passionate about what they produce.
What about in terms of how these materials relate space when you're talking about indoor, outdoor? You talk about pavilions and these homes that you build on Nantucket, oftentimes they're summer homes. So the outside is almost sometimes more important than the inside. So how does that relationship to natural materials kind of spill out into exterior?
Well, in Nantucket, it's easy. It's cedar and shingle. Sometimes you can do shiplap, depending on where you are. But I think a lot about floors when I think about indoor, outdoor. Like right now, we're working on a project where we're going to do flagstone flooring through the house and outside as well, and it's a summer home. And just thinking about that continuity going through the glazing of the building and how you will feel that on your feet getting out of the pool, and your footprints will dry as you go into the inside of the house. But I think you can also flip that, and you can say the interior is going to be very different than the exterior. And maybe you're in a more traditional home, but you want a modern interior. So
I think that, it's funny because not everything fits for every project, and what you just related to, having that stone that goes from the outside and transitioning, I think a lot of us were probably envisioning a flush threshold, right? Protected by the elements, of course, but that you are able to step right into the interior and not understand where that dividing line was. But then to flip it, like you said, having more of a traditional home where you do have an exterior material and an interior. I think what is important to understand there is that, both are right. And it's really about, you guys have both talked about the experience and what that experience is. The footsteps is a great example. Everyone can picture that. So when you envision how your life will be in these spaces, those are the moments that make a big difference. And then to your point, like thinking about material, it's, well, when I do step into my home, what does that floor feel like? What does that material feel like? Is there continuity throughout the space, and how do I feel in the space?
Even though we use the word hand, right? I love that you use that because that's what we use as well internally here. We talk about the hand, but it's often the foot, but it's still the hand, But yeah, that's how it. I always, when I have clients here, and I always say, you know what? Take off your socks and shoes. Just walk on it. Like just take, jump on it, because at the end of the day, you're going to be living on it. How it feels matters.
Yeah.
And that's why I think when it comes to the finish, how you're actually sealing the floor is important, because not only does it need to protect the floor, you need to make sure people aren't slipping on it, but you need to make sure that it feels good on your feet. And that's why we do a lot of hospitality and actually health and fitness things where it's actually yoga's taking place on that, or exercise, or gyms and things like that, and where that really matters. The upkeep, the maintenance of the floor, but also how it feels on your bum, on your Lululemon pants, or on your bare feet,
How'd you know? You talk about hospitality. The Faraway Martha's Vineyard was a project that you guys collaborated on.
It is a great project. Yeah.
I have not personally been there. I've definitely seen the photos, and I would like to think I know exactly what that feels like walking into the lobby, and that has a lot to do with material, and the way you guys designed it. Talk about that project a little bit. What that meant for you. What that means in terms of like your hospitality wing, and what that means for you in terms of this seamless wood design.
I'll let you start, and I'd love to chime in. Yeah.
James helped us create a custom chevron floor out of. It looks reclaimed, but it's not. You found a process to make it look like it was aged.
Exactly, because it started. You came to us, and it was with Fran.
Mm-hmm. Is Fran here?
Is Fran here? No. Yeah, Fran, very talented designer. Yeah. The idea of coming from reclaimed, but also needing something else that maybe a little bit more.
We needed history. So it's an adaptive reuse project, and so the building has history. It kind of has a funny history. It was built as the dormitory for the cast and crew of Jaws. But regardless,
really? I didn't know that.
We wanted it to have...
And they were supposed to tear it down right after the movie.
Yes, and they didn't. And now you can stay there for a pretty penny. So to be able to create a floor out of such a genuine material that felt like it has history and should have been there forever was amazing. Yeah. But I think the biggest transformation for that lobby space was really, we expanded it and made it 2 stories. So when you walk into a space that has that volume and is coated in natural materials, there's marble and stone there, you can immediately start to feel a genuine hospitality feel.
I love that you touched upon the hospitality element, because for me, that is my background at the end of the day, and I care the most about how people feel in spaces. And for me, that's being translated through wood now. But the idea that you can create a space, like you guys did so well, that there's a warmth, that there's a that is part of the history, the vernacular of Edgartown. I mean, I grew up in Massachusetts, it's funny, and I used to vacation in Martha's as a kid, And who would have thought Martha's? And who would have thought that I'd be now doing projects there with you guys, And there is a history there, and I had no idea about that connection to Jaws and all that, because I used to like my childhood friends, like their parents were like extras on the beach on those scenes, they put up there, yeah. Exactly.
I think that's a great example of a timeless project too, where that space does feel not original, but like an ode to the original design. but there's still but there's a sense of new, right? The tone of the wood, and there's just that tonality of and consistency throughout.
A lot of times in projects we talk about layering, like the furniture layer, the decorative layer, and with that project it was really important that the architecture remained true to Edgartown, and that we, as you transition into the building, the interior architecture still feels very New England, but our muse for the furniture is James Taylor. And so, all of a sudden now we're mid-century modern. And we're playing with this idea of layering something into this to make it feel more modern. And we're always having that conversation in our work in Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, this idea of just being honest and genuine about what's there and then bringing it maybe more forward into the future or the contemporary.
Yeah, I mean, there's always it's always about relationships, right? How does X relate to Y? And then Z. But you're always thinking of things in terms of scale, right? So like I said before, the pillow and the sofa, right? You're not necessarily, and then the sofa to the room, and then the room to the house, and then the house to the landscape, right? Each one of these things has sort of a relationship. And so when we're thinking of we might have a more traditional exterior architecture, the interior architecture then might be sort of 1 or 2 steps away from that, but not a complete departure, right? And then the furnishings, to Andrew's point, might be 1 or 2 steps away from that. So you're kind of creating this fluidity. I think in general, we're always pushing more modern, but we're always very conscious of how far to go, right? And I think as a collaborative team, we encourage everyone has a voice. We want people to speak up, and we'll try things, and somebody might say, what, I think you took it too far, or you didn't take it far enough, push it a little bit more. But I think we're all each other's best and worst critics.
And I think that what we're talking about is easy to do when it's an existing building. When it's a new building, if we were to do that, it would look fake and weird, so we wouldn't do that, right?
Sure.
Then we're pushing modern.
Well, you're respecting what is there, right? And similar to seamless wood design, I think we could even simplify that to seamless design, where you talk about the experience of stepping away from traditional and going into something that's more modern. It's not this stark contrast that doesn't respect what is there. And if it's a new build, maybe it's the property or the surrounding homes on the street. You guys did another project in Nashville, the One Hotel. That was
right,
another collaboration.
Yep. Very different in scale, but I think
urban hotel, tall building. Yeah.
So what was that? Compared to Martha's. Compared to that, how is that project different for you guys?
I'll let you start.
They're very different projects. I think every project. We talk about this a lot when we talk to new clients. There are sort of a few constants in a project. One is the client and one is the context. And so in this case, the clients were different and the contexts were different. And so, you might sort of have a material, but where it's used, how it's used, why it's used, all of that is going to change. So, we are very much influenced by where we're working. So on Nantucket, we're influenced by Nantucket history. In Nashville, we spent a lot of time actually studying Tennessee and studying the Tennessee environment. And in that hotel, I mean, we've said this a million times and we still joke about it, but when we went down to Nashville for the first time to kind of look at all of the comp set, right? All of the competitive properties in the area. Every single one of them had a guitar in the lobby. Like every fucking one had a guitar in the lobby. And we literally, or musical notes, or whatever. And I remember we were sort of on our, I think in the car to the airport, and we said, well, the one thing we can tell you about our project in Nashville is we will not have a guitar in the lobby. And so we said, well, who's our muse? What is the project about? And we actually spent, a couple of days hiking and sort of exploring everything around.
Named Andy.
You did pick a pig named Andy. And we were in, tobacco barns, and we were in some of the lakes regions, and we were at the equestrian stables, and we were in the forests and caves, and there's a lot going on in Nashville that is not just about music. And so it was important for us to embrace that. And as we started to tell our story, the story of that hotel became the natural, also tied to the brand, right? The One Hotel really embraces nature and sustainability. And so for us, it was about sort of embracing the environment around Nashville and embracing all of this incredible topography and these incredibly, different natural landscapes. And so obviously that then leads into the selection of natural products and telling that story. And so for us, it was really about looking for, and that product has a ton of hand, right? I mean, the reception desk is a giant boulder, you know, and you sort of walk in, that's backed literally by tobacco leaves hanging behind the reception desk. And so I think for us, it was really about looking at materials that told that story through the lens that we had kind of established.
And James was able to source some amazing different textures of woods and finishes of woods.
That was such a cool project because there was
stuff.
lots of different wood elements, and it was just fun to kind of have a kind of a smorgasbord of different. Yeah, exactly. There was wood everywhere, and it was all different. But that's also cool. Again, that doesn't have to be one material, one move necessarily. You know, because it was, for us, it was wood everywhere. You know, and that's, I think, true to that brand certainly. But you guys really embrace that.
And I think hospitality itself kind of lends to a little bit more drama and layering. Yeah. So,
when you guys think about your collaboration on a project like the One Hotel, and there's obviously a vision that you guys are creating, but I would like to think that you're probably, you know, you almost have your own vision. How are you guys molding that together in terms of like what James can offer and what has been already designed?
Well, I'd like to think we have a vision, but really we're really kind of working. It's more of a dialogue, you know, where Andrew in this case and Fran came to me and said, "This is what we're imagining," you know, and then I bring some samples, we talk, and then it's a conversation, and then it's editing, it's reduction, it's saying, well, this could work, and what about this? And it's kind of it's using the material as a dialogue back and forth.
I like to think about the concept as a lens that you're looking through on the project, and it's not just for you to communicate with the client, but it's a lens that everyone on the project can look through. And so we share that lens with James, and he looks through it, he sees something a little bit different, and then he shows up at our office with like 20 samples of the coolest wood I've ever seen, introduced us to mushroom wood and all this stuff that was amazing. I think I got a sliver in that meeting, but it was, or a splinter. It was, and so that conceptual lens can help your collaborators.
Those are the best partners, right? The best partners are who are not just sort of listening mechanically and then, you know, regurgitating. They're bringing something to the table. Listen, we're not wood experts, right? We're designing and picking tones and materials and, you know, creating a vibe that we like, but we need a lot of people to help us realize that. And so when you're working with people who are experts in their particular field, you get their wisdom. You know, guys, this looks great. I would not use this product for this reason, right? And it's the same thing with our stone vendors. Like, guys, the stone's really soft. I wouldn't use it, you know, in a shower because it's going to absorb shampoo and you're going to get complaints. Well, great. Thank you for telling me. Like, you know, you're like, you know, we're all in this together, and the last thing any of us wants is a headache at the end. And so, an informed partner is going to steer you in the right direction, hopefully.
I think that, you know, James, kudos to you, because I think spending the time I've spent with you, what I've realized is that there's a lot of effort that goes into sourcing a lot of these materials. And I think that when we talk about, you know, natural materials versus, you know, synthetics is obviously, you know, or usually kind of a direct, easy replacement, like, hey, here's where you can source it. Where the natural material, if you really peel back the layers, it's just as easily sourced and oftentimes easier. It's just the willingness to do so and spending the time that I have with you. That's what I commend you the most on, is that you dig into this and you're bringing 20 samples to a meeting. It's not here's a couple stain samples or here's a white oak that works.
He's literally in the forest.
Walking through France,
Or in the case of mushroom wood, in the mushroom caves. For those of you guys who don't know what mushroom wood is, it's basically a softwood like hemlock that they grow, you know, in what's it called, mycology? I'm not sure. Where they grow.
You're asking the wrong person.
Where they grow mushrooms that we all eat, right? So they're grown on the planks, and then they remove the mushrooms, and then, you know, repeat that process. What happens is basically the mushrooms are kind of sucking out all the soft parts of those boards, so you get these beautifully naturally textured planks. And I was so happy that you guys embraced that for the project. You definitely can't walk on mushroom wood, but it's a beautiful wall. It's a beautiful wall treatment because it's been naturally aged by the mushrooms, by those magic mushrooms.
And you're serving mushrooms tonight, right?
Are we? Good. Thank you, Niall. Tying it in.
Andrew, Matt, James, thank you so much. Everyone in here, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Appreciate it.